I never expected peace to feel like a possession, but that's exactly what it became to me after retirement. Not a luxury, not a gift. A hard-earned, tangible thing I clung to. My name is Matthew Colton, and after 30 years working as a geological and environmental consultant, half of them in crisis zones from Hunt, Arizona to the Dawn Dakotas, I retired to a modest home tucked into the northern slope above Walt Echo Lake, a federally protected glacial lake just beyond the town limits of Silver Glen. Silver Glen was the kind of suburban dreamscape that builders drooled over brick entry signs, flower beds planted seasonally, and a HOA that wielded its rulebook like Holy Scripture. I'd chosen the northern ridge precisely because it sat outside the tightest grip of the HOA on land that had once been considered too uneven to be flattened for mass development. To me, it was perfect, raw, grounded, and deeply alive. My backyard sloped steeply into the hillside, dotted with native grasses and layered rock I had no intention of disturbing. I had built erosion control terraces with my own hands, using reclaimed stone and natural slope dynamics to protect the land and the lake below. Years earlier in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, I had even helped catalog this very watershed as part of a conservation initiative back when Echo Lake was nearly declared unstable due to nearby construction. Those files were still in my attic. The ink might have faded, but I hadn't forgotten what the land meant. So when I first heard the machine's low, guttural rumbling, like the growl of a buried beast, I thought perhaps someone nearby was doing septic work. It was spring after all, and mud season always brought with it some degree of construction chaos. But when the ground-shaking thuds grew louder and the sound didn't go away after hours, I walked around the northern bend of my property and stopped dead in my tracks. There were 2 earth movers and a dump truck, and they weren't just near my land, they were on it. I stood still for several moments, processing what I was seeing: men in reflective vests hauling loads of soil from the rear slope of my property. It wasn't a minor scrape either. Entire sections of topsoil had been carved out, leaving jagged teeth in the earth like something had chewed its way through. I waved my arms as I approached, boots crunching over broken rock. "Hey, who authorized this?" The nearest worker turned down the volume on his walkie and shouted over the idling truck engine. "Silver Glen, HOA. We're moving fill for the lower basin." "The what?" He pointed vaguely toward the lake, that depression by the picnic tables. "They're expanding it. Drainage stabilization project," they said. I knew exactly what he was talking about. The seasonal floodplain on the southwest edge of Echo Lake. It was a natural low spot that acted as a buffer when the lake swelled. Every ecological report in the past 2 decades had emphasized its importance. It wasn't meant to be stabilized. It was meant to exist as it was. "You're trespassing," I said firmly, my voice low but pointed. "This is private land." HOA president said it was common slope, said it wasn't maintained. I narrowed my eyes. That was a lie, and I knew it. I had property markers placed not just on paper, but with reinforced boundary stones. I'd measured and registered every foot of this land back when I bought it. I took photos of the equipment, the trucks, the visible soil disturbance. Then I called the Silver Glen HOA office. Silver Glen HOA came the clipped voice of a receptionist. "How can I help you?" "This is Matthew Colton. I need to speak with whoever authorized construction crews to excavate land behind my property." A pause. "You'll have to speak to President Wall Albright. He's out on site today." "I am on site," I said, voice tight. "And he's not here, but his contractors are digging up my land." More silence. Then, "Sir, if that area has been deemed undeveloped community slope." "It's not community slope," I snapped. "It's deeded, surveyed, and maintained by me. He's taking protected earth, and I'm giving you official notice. Your crews are trespassing." I hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept playing the noise of those machines in my head, ripping, gnashing, gouging. I felt it in my bones. The next morning, I walked the slope line with my original surveyor's map in one hand and my phone in the other. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Not only had they crossed onto my land, by at least 30 feet, they had begun excavating near an old fracture line. I had flagged years ago a sensitive geological vein that, if disrupted, could destabilize the entire slope above the lake's south shore. I took more photos, videos this time. Soil composition, the angle of disruption, the equipment paths. I documented everything as if I were back on contract. Old instincts kicked in. I emailed the evidence to 3 places: the HOA, the County Zoning Office, and most importantly, the State Department of Environmental Quality. I didn't go nuclear. Not yet. But I wanted the first shot fired to be measured, meticulous, and backed by data. Later that week, I received an envelope from the HOA in my mailbox, a violation notice. They claimed my slope was not properly maintained and cited me for unmanaged vegetation and hazardous grade inconsistency. I laughed out loud. They were trying to punish me for their own theft, but they didn't know who I was. Not really. They didn't know the history of this hill, the science beneath their feet, or the fact that they were siphoning material from a federally adjacent conservation zone. And they certainly didn't know that I still had friends in environmental enforcement. They were tampering with land they didn't understand, but I did. I always had. By the time Friday morning rolled around, a full quarter of the northern slope had been sheared away, like the edge of a cake sliced without care. The crews didn't even try to hide their tracks. Deep gouges from excavator treads ran across native fescue, and my terracing stones had been shoved into haphazard piles like broken teeth. The wild sedge I had nurtured over a decade, with its shallow-rooted resilience that kept runoff in check, was gone. Just like that. What struck me most wasn't the damage, it was the speed. They were working fast, too fast, as if they knew what they were doing was wrong and wanted to finish before anyone could stop them. I walked down the trail that snaked past my property boundary and followed the flatbed truck tracks toward the lake. When I reached the clearing just past the woods, my breath caught. They were dumping the my soil into the basin just north of the shoreline picnic area, the one nestled beside Echo Lake's shallow southern cove. A cove I had once sampled for freshwater invertebrate populations as part of a now-defunct regional study. A cove that filtered runoff during the rains and gave dragonflies a place to breed. Now it was being filled and smoothed over with red clay and loam, forming a sort of platform, flat-wide, unnatural. A new playground, the banner red printed in bright primary colors and zip-tied to 2 temporary wooden posts. Silver Glen, recreational expansion coming summer 2025. My stomach turned. I walked the perimeter of the project area and noted the absence of erosion controls, no sediment fences, no runoff channels, no stabilization grids, just raw earth spilling into a protected lake. And not just any lake. Echo Lake wasn't some arbitrary pond. It was designated a Class 3 conservation water body by the state and federally mapped in the Watershed Integrity Program. That meant buffer zones, setback restrictions, and mandatory environmental impact reports for any soil alteration within 200 feet of its edges. It also meant that disturbing sediment near its shoreline without state permits was more than reckless, it was illegal. I pulled my phone from my jacket and started filming, narrating what I saw in the calm, clipped tone I'd used 100 times in the field. Slope angles, topsoil conditions, water turbidity in the cove. It all painted the same picture: unmanaged fill operation likely without proper authorization, with direct risk to a federally sensitive ecosystem. Then I spotted the orange vest. A woman, mid-50s, angular haircut, HOA name tag, clipped onto her clipboard, stood by the picnic bench watching the operation like a general surveying a battlefield. Her name was Karen Albright, president of the Silver Glen HOA, and she was smiling. I approached with slow, even steps. "Excuse me," I said. "Can we talk?" She turned, eyes flitting to my boots, which were still crusted with hill mud. "You're Colton, aren't you?" "That's right," I replied. "And that hill you're stripping from, it's mine." She waved a dismissive hand. "Our property maps show that slope is undeveloped and within community purview." "Then your maps are wrong. I have county-verified surveys and 2 separate land inspections to back me. You've removed over 30 feet of privately owned terrain without permission." "Mr. Colton," she said with an exasperated sigh, "this is for the benefit of the neighborhood. The recreational zone needs expansion. You live on the outskirts, surely you understand the importance of community integration." "I understand erosion science, Ms. Albright," I said, voice tightening. "I understand hydrological cycles. I understand what happens when you fill a basin that nature uses to regulate overflow. And I understand that Echo Lake is protected under state and federal law. Her smile faltered. The HOA has filed all the proper documents, she replied, but the edge in her voice had sharpened. We've been assured by our landscape consultant that it's all above board. Then I'm sure you won't mind sharing those permits with me. The ones from the Department of Environmental Quality, or the Army Corps of Engineers. She didn't respond. I'll wait, I said. But she didn't wait. She turned and walked briskly toward her car, pulled out her phone and began talking soft, terse words with quick glances in my direction. That night, my mailbox was stuffed with another notice, a second violation. This time for obstruction of HOA operations and unauthorized confrontation with community representatives. They were doubling down. I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope still unopened beside me, and pulled up my contacts. I hadn't spoken to Miles in years. Not since he left the Department of Environmental Quality to work on glacial watershed modeling in Colorado, but I knew he still had contacts. I drafted a short email, attached the video, and hit send. Then I sent another email to the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. I knew the protocol, knew what to include. Photos, GPS data, date-stamped footage, reference citations from the Watershed Integrity Act, and a short note at the end. Unauthorized fill activity from HOA onto a protected Class 3 body. Soil origin appears to be private land. High risk of sediment contamination. Potential violation of Clean Water Act Title 4, Section 2. By morning, I had a reply from the EPA. Thank you for this detailed documentation. We are coordinating with DEQ and local enforcement. Please refrain from any further personal confrontations. A site visit is being scheduled. I sat back in my chair. They were coming. Not just the HOA's landscapers or the town zoning committee. Federal oversight. And if they found what I suspected, that unpermitted fill had been dumped within proximity of the lake's waterline, it wouldn't just be fines or citations. It could mean full shutdowns, permit revocations, legal orders to reverse the damage. Still, part of me worried they wouldn't come fast enough. The longer the soil sat in that basin, the more the lake suffered. Rain was in the forecast, and with every drop, that fine clay could wash straight into Echo Lake's heart. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about Legacy Mine and the lakes. By Sunday morning, I could already see the changes in the lake. What had once been crystal clear, cold glacial runoff that mirrored the sky like polished obsidian was now dull. A greenish film forming where the cove curved inward. I crouched on the bank and watched a swirl of fine sediment lazily sink and dissipate into the deeper water. Tadpoles that used to flit near the edge were nowhere to be seen. The dragonfly clusters were scattered. A thin sheen clung to the surface like a wound. It had begun. The slope they had stripped from my land was largely clay-rich, fine and silty, almost dangerously so when loosened in bulk. It didn't take much to cloud the water. And if they kept adding more to the makeshift fill zone, the cumulative damage wouldn't be aesthetic. It would be ecological. I returned to my house and scanned through the HOA's public digital records. My eyes narrowed when I found a new document recently uploaded. Community Expansion Proposal, Phase 2 Recreational Zone. It outlined a planned amphitheater, upgraded walking paths, and a playground extension with tiered seating, all situated directly within the basin adjacent to Echo Lake. It even included colorful renderings showing a stylized family area, complete with artificial turf, shaded picnic zones, and a lakefront activity pad. The document referenced a landscape contractor, Delridge & Sons Outdoor Designs. I knew that name. They had been cited 5 years ago for improper fill use in the north quarter of White River Hollow, a case I had consulted on peripherally during my last year working with the Watershed Board. They had a reputation for cutting corners and pushing the envelope. More disturbing still, I found no attached environmental impact report. No DEQ letters. No public notification filings, which were required by state law for any development within 50 feet of a water body, even if technically on private HOA-managed land. It was all being fast-tracked under the radar. I forwarded the documents to the EPA contact and added a short note. Attached is internal HOA planning material. No mention of environmental review. No permit numbers provided. Phase 2 location is within buffer zone. Activity ongoing. Urgent. Then, I printed everything I had: photos, maps, county records, annotated screenshots of the HOA plans, and prepared a binder. I wasn't just compiling evidence, I was building a case. I called the zoning office on Monday morning. I asked for the project permit officer. "I'm sorry," said a weary-voiced clerk. "We don't have any recent permits for large-scale recreational work in Silver Glen. Just a minor tree trimming authorization filed in March." "No soil movement?" I asked. "No topographical changes?" "Not that I can find. Nothing near Echo Lake." I thanked her and hung up. The next move had to be face-to-face. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked outside the Silver Glen Community Center, where the HOA held its weekly meetings. The lot was surprisingly full for a Monday. A printed flyer on the door read, "HOA Open Meeting, Recreational Upgrade Planning Committee, 5:00 p.m. Perfect. I stepped inside carrying my binder like a shield. Inside, residents milled about, in clusters sipping lemonade and chatting as if they were waiting for a garden tour. At the head of the room stood Karen Albright, clipboard in hand, speaking with two younger board members. She wore a blazer the color of fresh concrete, her hair perfectly parted, like she'd measured it with a level. I waited until she finished speaking, then stepped forward. "Ms. Albright," I said. She turned, her smile flattening. "Mr. Colton, are you here to cause another disruption? I'm here to ask you one question." She raised a brow. "Did Delridge and Sons provide you with the required environmental impact assessments for Phase 2? The room around us quieted slightly. Karen's expression froze, then quickly shifted into a practiced politeness. "I believe all documentation is in order." "That's not an answer," I said, voice firm, "because I checked with the zoning office. And with DEQ, there are no permits on file for the work being done by the lake. And what you're doing isn't just cosmetic landscaping, it's structural earth modification within a federally mapped buffer zone." She leaned in slightly, smile sharp. "You don't represent the HOA, Mr. Colton. You're not on the board. This isn't your concern." I opened the binder and flipped it toward her, showing side-by-side maps, one from the Watershed Integrity Program and one from her HOA expansion plan. "You're filling in a floodplain. That land isn't dead weight. It's active. That basin takes pressure off the lake during heavy rains. What happens when your platform blocks runoff and the slope above it starts sliding?" A murmur passed through the room. "Are you suggesting we're endangering the lake?" she asked coolly. "I'm not suggesting," I said. "I'm reporting." She closed her clipboard with an audible snap. I left before the meeting resumed, though I could feel the eyes on me as I walked out. Some annoyed, others uncertain. Maybe a few grateful. It didn't matter. The facts were on my side. Back home, I received an email from the Department of Environmental Quality that read, "Site review scheduled for end of week. Echo Lake flagged for provisional buffer integrity assessment. Contact USGS, confirms concern of recent fill movement. Stay available." That night, I watched the lake from my deck. The moonlight caught the dull shimmer of the new soil by the basin. It looked wrong, artificial, like a scar over sacred ground. And I realized then, for the first time in weeks, that I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. They had turned my home into a battleground. But they were playing a game with rules they didn't understand. And I was done watching. 2 days later, the soil was still being dumped. Trucks came in early before most residents had even started their coffee and left before lunch. They were clever about it. The work was quiet enough not to rouse suspicion, but consistent enough that the transformation was unmistakable. What had once been a marshy overflow area, teeming with reeds, frogs, and groundwater trickles, was now a half-packed platform of red earth and stamped tire tracks. The grass had stopped growing. The dragonflies were gone. And despite the pending visit from the state's Environmental Review Board, the HOA continued as though nothing was wrong. That morning, I walked the perimeter again. The air was muggy, and the smell of damp soil was mixed with something sharp: diesel fumes and fresh-cut synthetic lumber. Near the bank, I spotted a new sign. "Silver Glen, Lakeside Commons under construction. Please pardon our progress." They weren't just denying wrongdoing. They were doubling down on visibility. I returned to my house, gathered my documentation binder, and drove to the Township Administration Building. At the clerk's desk, I requested a formal public records filing on all HOA project permits submitted in the last 90 days. The woman behind the desk, a polite but tired-looking administrator named Judith, took my information and disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her brow was furrowed. "There's only one file under Silver Glen," she said. "And it's a landscaping request for trailhead maintenance. Nothing about shoreline alterations or slope grading." She slid the thin folder toward me. "May I copy this?" I asked. "Please do," she said. "Honestly, we've had issues with them before. Quiet complaints, never quite enough to act on." I nodded. This might be more than enough. When I got home that afternoon, an unmarked white envelope was taped to my door. It was another HOA violation, my third, the listed infraction this time: obstruction of community cohesion and repeated contact with municipal authorities without HOA board clearance. I laughed aloud, sharp, bitter. They were trying to muzzle me. The language was absurd, borderline satirical. Community cohesion. Since when did speaking up to protect federal wetlands violate neighborhood unity? But it wasn't funny, not really. This was retaliation, blatant organized retaliation. They were hoping to discredit me by papering my file with citations. If they got enough violations on record, they could try to initiate proceedings to censure, or even lien my property. A legal maneuver that allowed them to find me aggressively, and if left, unpaid, place legal pressure on my deed. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was strategic. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. I scanned the letter, attached it to my EPA file, and forwarded it to my contact at the Department of Environmental Quality, with a note: HOA issuing retaliatory violations for environmental whistleblowing. See attached. Timeline of project documentation continues. Requesting confirmation of pending review. That evening, I received a response. Confirmed. Site inspection confirmed for Thursday. State Water Quality Division will attend. We appreciate your detailed record keeping. I exhaled slowly. They were coming, and I wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. That night, my neighbor, a quiet woman named Ruth, who lived 3 houses over, stopped by my gate while I was watering my front garden. "Hi," she said softly, hands clasped nervously. "I just wanted to ask. Is it true about the lake?" I turned off the spigot. "What have you heard?" "That it's being filled in for a playground." "Partially. It's a flood basin and they're covering it with soil from my property." Her eyes widened. "But isn't that illegal? I mean, it's a lake." "It's federally protected. The HOA's pretending otherwise." She hesitated. "Can I help?" I looked at her for a long moment. Actually, I said yes. We sat at my dining room table as I showed her the maps, the photos, the violation letters, the permit records, or lack thereof. She watched silently, brows furrowed, fingers gripping her tea like a life raft. "I didn't know it was this serious," she said finally. Karen President Albright, she made it sound like a small project, just beautifying the community. She didn't mention the lake. She wouldn't. Ruth bit her lip. "I'm part of the garden committee. I see the budget sometimes. I can check for anything odd." "Do," I said. "Look for contractor payments, off-book expenses, anything with Delridge and Sons." She nodded, then hesitated again. "You know they're talking about you, right, on the community board, calling you uncooperative, even dangerous." "Good," I said calmly. "Let them." Over the next 2 days, Ruth slipped me copies of 2 internal emails. One was between Karen and the HOA's treasurer, discussing how to fast-track final construction without interference from outlier residents. The second was, worse, a conversation about documenting a pattern of aggression from Mr. Colton in case legal action is needed. They weren't just preparing to fight me. They were preparing to erase me. But Thursday came anyway, and with it 4 SUVs bearing state plates, 2 officials in EPA jackets, and a drone operator with a USGS vest. I stood at the edge of my property, arms folded as they set up tripods, scanned the slope, and took water samples at 3 points around the cove. One of the inspectors, a man in his 40s with a salt and pepper beard and calm clinical eyes, introduced himself as Devin Kerr. "You're the whistleblower?" he asked. "I'm the property owner," I said, "and the former consultant who surveyed this lake 15 years ago." He nodded once. "Then you already know what we're about to find." 2 hours later, they had everything they needed. Soil degradation, evidence of unpermitted fill, no silt fencing, no ecological buffer. Clear encroachment onto a protected watershed zone. Kerr closed his notebook and looked toward the newly flattened basin with a tight jaw. "They're not just out of line," he muttered. "They're in violation of multiple state ordinances and at least one federal provision. This'll get escalated fast." As the inspectors loaded their gear, Karen Albright stormed down the trail, face flushed, high heels digging into the dirt like she was stabbing the earth itself. "Excuse me," she barked. "What is this? Who authorized this?" Kerr turned slowly. "The Yale State Department of Environmental Quality. Echo Lake has been flagged for emergency buffer assessment. All construction must cease immediately. Effective now." She blinked. "You can't just walk onto our property and—" "This is a state-designated water body, ma'am," he said, holding up a laminated badge. "And your property is under investigation for unlawful ecological alteration." Her face drained of color. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. She turned toward me with trembling lips, something between fury and panic in her expression. I held her gaze, and in that moment I knew they'd gone too far. And they knew it too. The next morning, the machines were silent. No more trucks rattling past my fence. No more backhoes clawing at my hillside. Just the birdsong, tentative at first, returning as if nature herself was holding her breath and listening. The basin by the lake sat still and raw, a half-filled wound, surrounded by bright yellow caution tape, now fluttering in the breeze. I watched from my deck, cradling a mug of black coffee, the steam curling up like memory. It felt like a ceasefire. Not a victory, not yet, but a pause. And I knew what I had to do next. After finishing my coffee, I climbed into the attic. The heat up there was stifling, thick with dust and insulation, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. In the far back corner, beneath a tarp-covered trunk of old field boots and geology journals, sat a heavy aluminum file case, the last artifact from my consulting days. I hadn't opened it since I retired. The latches groaned as I flipped them up, the hinges stiff with time. Inside were neatly labeled folders. Echo Watershed Project, dated 2008 through 2010. I thumbed through the records, topographical surveys, soil core analyses, aerial imagery annotated with colored grease pencil. I found the map I was looking for, printed on vellum, yellowing at the edges. It was a composite survey of the north and south buffer zones of Echo Lake, including the area that had now become the HOA's new dumping ground. There it was, in black ink and red notation: seasonal basin overflow, clay-rich substrata, high erosion risk if disturbed. I remembered when I wrote that. It was raining the day we took samples, light spring drizzle, the kind that seeps into your boots and your bones. I'd stood on that very edge, feeling the soft give of the earth underfoot, and told the junior tech, if anyone ever fills this, the lake's clarity will be gone in a year. And now here we were. I brought the file downstairs, made high-resolution scans of the most critical documents, and labeled them with dates, GPS coordinates, and photographic markers. I sent the whole packet to my contacts at both the DEQ and the EPA. I also attached a copy to a backup hard drive and slipped it into my fireproof Shoal safe. I wasn't paranoid. I was practiced. Later that day, Devin Kerr called. "We reviewed your materials," he said, his voice more urgent now. "Your original field data's been incredibly helpful. It's now part of our preliminary violation report." "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad," he said. "We've got direct evidence of fill sourced from unauthorized extraction runoff into protected waters and deliberate misrepresentation of jurisdiction. On top of that, there's an internal communication leak suggesting the HOA knowingly bypassed the permit process." My jaw tightened. "Ruth, your neighbor?" he asked. She gave me the emails. "Well, someone's about to blow the whistle officially. Legal will be in touch. If you're willing to testify or submit a formal statement, this can move even faster." "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. As I hung up, I looked back at the hill. It had changed. What had once been a seamless part of my life's rhythm, walking the slope, tending the native plants, observing seasonal shifts, was now scarred, exposed, dissected. But beneath that wound was something older and stronger. I could still see the bones of the land, rock, strata, water paths, life still clinging to the margins. I spent the afternoon laying out temporary erosion control. I didn't wait for the HOA or the contractors. I staked biodegradable netting along the exposed slope and started packing in native seed mix by hand: blue grama bottle brush, squirrel tail, Western wheatgrass. I was rebuilding. Around sunset, Ruth came by again. This time she brought banana bread and a folder. "They're panicking," she said, handing me the folder. "Karen tried to call an emergency session of the board today. She was shouting in the rec center hallway about environmental terrorists and overreach from the state." I smiled. She always did have a gift for drama. "This," Ruth said, pointing to the folder, "is the budget trail." I flipped through it. Line items marked as community improvement funds had been rerouted: $27,000 to Delridge & Sons, another $14,000 to a shell company registered under a different landscaping business, most likely to cover their tracks. She knew, I whispered. She knew what she was doing. "She did," Ruth said softly. "And now people are asking questions." I overheard one of the board members saying they'd never have approved it if they'd known about the lake restrictions. "They didn't know," I said, because she didn't tell them. I sent the files to Devon within the hour. That night, a storm rolled in. Not a violent one, but long and steady hours of cold rain beating down on the wounded hill and the half-finished fill zone by the lake. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the water slipping through the clay, finding the softest place, and breaking free. At 2:17 a.m., a vibration buzzed across my nightstand, an emergency alert from the town. Flash flood advisory minor, slope instability detected near Echo Lake shoreline. Public access restricted. I threw on my coat and boots and drove down to the lake. State inspectors were already there, headlamps bobbing in the dark, surveying the new fractures that had formed along the edge of the fill site. One portion had sloughed off into the lake, leaving a crescent-shaped gouge in the mud. Turbidity meters in the water glowed red. Kerr met me near the barricade. "The platform shifted," he said. "It didn't fully collapse, but the slopes compromised." I looked at the water. It was cloudy, sick. "They took a living system," I said, "and tried to make it flat." Kerr didn't reply. He didn't need to. I went home as the rain tapered off. The next morning, the town council issued an emergency motion. All activity related to Silver Glen's recreational expansion project is hereby suspended indefinitely. Echo Lake is to be considered an off-limits protected site pending final assessment. HOA members received formal notices. Karen Albright received a personal summons, and the lake at last was left alone. For now. The storm had passed, but the damage lingered like a bruise under the surface. By the end of the week, Echo Lake no longer resembled the place I had known for over a decade. The sediment bloom extended nearly 30 feet from the shoreline. What used to be a clear transition from pebbled shallows into sapphire blue was now a murky soup of clay runoff and floating debris. Even the fish smallmouth, bass sunfish, and the rare yellow perch had retreated to deeper, cleaner sections far from the basin, and the slope above it looked like a battlefield. The section they had carved from my hill had destabilized in several places, though the major fracture had held barely hairline cracks were visible from my porch. I walked the path slowly each morning, measuring their creep with pebbles, stakes, and patience. There was no question in my mind, had the storm been a little stronger, a full landslide could have torn down everything, flooding the lake, with tons of unfiltered soil and rock. And yet, despite everything, the HOA still hadn't admitted fault. They had gone silent. Not remorseful, just quiet. Their public communications dried up. Their cheerful newsletters disappeared, and the HOA website's updates were frozen in time. No apologies, no retractions, just a wall of silence from the very people who once boasted about beautification and community unity. But I knew that silence wasn't peace. It was calculation. I received a certified letter that Tuesday, a notice to appear before the HOA grievance board. The stated purpose: to discuss repeated violations of conduct and interference with neighborhood improvements. It was laughable, really. The lake had been declared off-limits. The state was preparing formal charges, yet somehow I was the one being summoned. Ruth insisted on attending with me. So did a few other neighbors, people who had once kept their distance, but now sent me quiet nods in the street, as if ashamed it had taken this long to see what was happening. The meeting took place in the rec center's main hall. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing a folding table with a white cloth draped over it as if the HOA board were judges at a county fair. Karen Albright sat at the center, her posture a portrait of forced composure. The other board members flanked her. Jim O'Neill, who always looked bored, Lisa Tanner, whose nervous smiles betrayed her discomfort, and 2 others I didn't recognize. I took my seat calmly, Ruth beside me. Mr. Colton, Karen began clasping her hands together. We are here today to address the disruptive pattern of behavior you've exhibited in recent months. No, I said flatly. She blinked. I'm sorry. This isn't your hearing, I continued. It's mine. And yet you violated state law, federal water regulations, trespassed on my property, and nearly caused a landslide into a protected ecosystem. You filled a flood basin without permits and tried to bury the evidence, literally. I will not sit here and play your game. Karen's jaw clenched. Mr. Colton, please. I filed a civil complaint, I said, pulling a folded copy from my jacket. This is a copy for your records. The original has been submitted to the county. My lawyer has advised me to make no further statements regarding your board's conduct outside of official legal channels. The room was silent. Karen didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, she said, you're attempting to weaponize bureaucracy to prevent the neighborhood from improving itself. I almost laughed. You mean like you weaponized it to try to find me into silence? Lisa Tanner shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Karen, maybe we should... Karen snapped. Ruth stood up. You lied to us. You said this project was permitted, that it was approved, that there were no environmental concerns. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. People trusted you, Ruth added, voice trembling. We trusted you. The rest of the room remained still, watching. Later that night, I received another letter. This one from the county clerk's office. The Silver Glen Homeowners Association is currently under review for non-compliance with municipal construction guidelines and violation of environmental protection ordinances. A hearing date has been set. You may be asked to provide testimony. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the binder with the rest. Then I received a phone call from Devin Kerr. We have enough to escalate, he said. The EPA is preparing an administrative enforcement action. We're coordinating with the State Attorney General's office. You've done everything by the book, Matthew. We'll handle the rest from here. And for the first time in months, I felt a strange sensation relief. Not victory, not vindication, just the quiet lifting of a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. The land had spoken, the water had spoken. Now the law would follow. That evening, I returned to the slope. The rain had left behind small channels in the raw earth, tiny rivulets that traced old paths the water had once followed. I knelt down, dug my fingers into the cool soil, and let it fall through my hand. Then I planted the first tuft of switchgrass. Native, resilient, deep-rooted. The hill had been wounded, but it would recover. So would I. The white vans arrived just after sunrise. There were 3 of them, each marked with the insignia of the Environmental Protection Agency and the United States Geological Survey. Plain but unmistakable. One carried water testing equipment, another topographical scanning tools, and the third, judging by the rolling satellite antenna mounted on its roof, was here to conduct aerial mapping. It was a full-scale investigation now. No more inspections from clipboard interns or polite county liaisons. This was the federal government, and they came not with caution, but with certainty. I watched from the edge of my porch as the teams fanned out across the basin and shoreline. One group in waders stepped into the lake's edge, lowering turbidity sensors and water sample canisters on lines marked in red. Another crew set up tripods along the slope, using laser rangefinders to measure shifts in the terrain since the excavation. It was eerie to watch so many strangers crawl across land I had spent years preserving. But for the first time, I didn't feel helpless. I felt heard. Kerr arrived last, stepping out of a black government SUV. He was dressed in a simple jacket and carried a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. His expression was unreadable as he crossed the lawn to where I stood. Morning, Matthew. You brought a full circus. He nodded almost apologetically. That's because this is a mess, and not a small one. I motioned toward the collapsed edge of the fill zone. Sheared during the last storm, took out part of the buffer zone, and dropped about 30 cubic yards into the water. We got the drone footage, he said. It's worse than we thought. The sediment plume stretches halfway across the lake now. There's already been oxygen depletion in the cove. Fish kills will follow if it isn't reversed. Can it be reversed? Kerr exhaled slowly. Partially. With time. And the right restoration effort. I nodded. I'll help. I was hoping you'd say that, he said, then pulled a folded document from his bag and handed it to me. Advance notice. We're issuing a formal cease and desist to the HOA. Effective immediately. All work in and around Echo Lake must stop, including called community improvements. I scanned the letter. At the bottom were two signatures, one from the regional EPA director, the other from the State Water Resources chair. This is real, I said. This is federal law, he replied. Down at the basin, one of the agents waved to him. Kerr gave me a nod and jogged over, leaving me standing alone with the document fluttering in my hand. That afternoon, the EPA agents met with several HOA board members in a closed-door session inside the Silver Glen Community Center. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. The tension was visible from across the parking lot. Karen Albright arrived 20 minutes late, face-tight heels clicking across the pavement like punctuation marks. She clutched a briefcase like it might shield her from the avalanche she knew was coming. Inside, they were shown photographs, datasets, permit files, none of which the HOA had ever acquired. The EPA outlined the full scope of their violations: unpermitted alteration of protected watershed land, illegal fill deposit within 50 feet of a federal water body, unauthorized extraction of privately owned soil, retaliation against a whistleblower and property owner. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the time it ended, the sky had turned amber with sunset, and the board members emerged like ghosts. Karen didn't speak to anyone. She went straight to her car and drove off fast. The next morning, a notice was posted on the HOA's community board and sent via email to all residents. Notice of compliance order. Due to confirmed violations of state and federal environmental protections, all activity related to the recreational zone expansion near Echo Lake has been suspended. Echo Lake has been classified as a restricted access zone until further notice. The HOA is cooperating fully with ongoing investigations. Residents are advised to avoid the affected areas. Silver Glen HOA Board of Directors. Beneath the message, someone had anonymously scrawled in blue ink, or you could have just listened to Colton. By noon, I had 5 neighbors knock on my door. Some came with apologies, others with questions. A few just wanted to sit quietly on the porch and watch the lake with me, as if to remember it the way it had been before. Ruth came last, carrying a manila envelope. Karen resigned this morning, she said. Sent a group email to the board. Claims she's being unfairly targeted. She's not, I replied. I know. But that won't stop her from playing the victim. I opened the envelope. Inside were internal board messages showing she'd been advised multiple times to pause the project until permits could be verified, but she pressed forward anyway. Ruth had highlighted one note in particular. Karen had written, "The Colton property is underused and irrelevant. He's a legacy holdout. He won't fight us for long." I folded the paper, placed it on the table, and looked out over the hill. She was wrong, I said. Later that week, I was asked to speak at the town council meeting. Not as a victim, not even as a complainant, but as an expert witness. I brought my maps, my soil reports. I explained the biology of the flood basin, the role of native grasses in slope stabilization, the long-term risk of sedimentary runoff. I didn't mention the violations, I let the data speak. After I finished, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time in this entire ordeal, they applauded. Not because I won, but because the land had spoken through me and someone had finally listened. 3 days after the council meeting, Echo Lake was ringed with orange barricades and hand-lettered signs. No public access. Federal enforcement in effect. They didn't even try to make it look polite. Bright yellow tape wrapped around the trail entrances. The pier was chained off, canoes were removed, fishing hours canceled, and the new commons area that the HOA had so proudly advertised now sat abandoned, half-drowned, under a thin sheen of stagnant runoff. It wasn't just a suspension, it was a declaration. Echo Lake was closed, and the ripple effect began immediately. Parents complained that their kids could no longer play near the water. Dog walkers grumbled about losing access to the trail loops. Morning joggers, those who once smiled and waved as they ran past my gate, now paused long enough to frown at the caution signs, and then glance just briefly toward my home on the hill. As if I had done this. As if I had taken the lake away. But I hadn't. I'd simply uncovered what had already been happening. The lake didn't vanish because of me, it vanished because someone thought they could shape nature. Like it was sidewalk chalk erase what didn't suit their plan and color in something prettier. That weekend, Silver Glen held a town hall. Not an HOA meeting this time, It was organized by the town itself and attended by over 70 residents. I went more out of obligation than desire, but Ruth insisted. So did a handful of others' neighbors I hadn't spoken to before, who now wanted updates, explanations, clarity. It was held in the high school gymnasium. Folding chairs, a makeshift stage, a large printout of the lake's satellite view taped to the wall. At the front, a panel of town officials sat beneath harsh lights. EPA representatives stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly ready to answer the same question a dozen ways. When will we get our lake back? I stayed near the rear of the room, arms folded, listening as tempers simmered just beneath the surface. The HOA's remaining board members, those who hadn't already stepped down, sat together off to one side, stiff as tombstones. Then a man in the third row stood up, short-cropped hair, windbreaker, maybe mid-40s. This whole thing, he said, started with that guy up on the hill. Right? Dozens of eyes turned. I didn't move. He continued, "You shut down the project. Then the state got involved. Now no one can use the lake. That's what happened." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I could have let it sit. I could have said nothing. But that man's words were a match on dry brush. So I stood. "My name is Matthew Colton," I said, voice steady, projecting so everyone could hear without shouting. And yes, I reported what the HOA was doing, because it was illegal, because they excavated land from my property without permission, because they filled a flood basin next to a protected watershed and lied about it. The man crossed his arms. "But now none of us can use the lake." "Because they broke the law," I said. Not because I told the truth. A woman near the front raised her hand. "But why didn't you come to us sooner? Why didn't you warn the neighborhood?" "I did," I replied. "You just didn't hear me over the sound of playground, construction, and bulldozers." Silence. Ruth stood beside me now. I was on the garden committee. I saw the budgets. The permits were never filed. Karen Albright misled the board and then retaliated against Matthew for speaking up. He didn't do this. He tried to stop it. Another neighbor stood, a man I recognized but didn't know by name. "My daughter has asthma. Since the dirt trucks came through, she hasn't been able to play outside. Her inhaler use doubled. No one told us they were kicking up that much dust." A third voice, "I thought the lake was protected. I didn't know we could even build near it." Now the mood was shifting. The target no longer on me, but on the void, the absence of transparency, the absence of care. Devin Kerr took the stage next and spoke plainly. "We have no intention of keeping Echo Lake closed forever, but water quality is compromised. There's runoff sediment buildup and bacterial changes we need to study. If we reopen it too soon, we'll be endangering everyone here." He paused, then added, "But we also have something else. A proposed restoration plan, and we'll need community support to implement it." A large screen lit up behind him, showing a slide titled Echo Lake Ecological Recovery Project. Underneath were bullet points: and remove artificial fill and restore flood basin contours, replant native grasses and shoreline species, install long-term erosion controls, rebuild with sustainable materials under oversight. Then, to my surprise, a photo of my slope flashed on the screen. A before and after, one image of the stripped hill, the other from just last week, showing my early restoration efforts. This, Devin said, pointing, was done by Mr. Colton. On his own time, with native seed, using knowledge from his former career as an environmental consultant. We'd like him to lead the advisory group for the restoration. I stared at the screen, stunned. Then the applause started. Not thunderous, not standing ovation, but steady, genuine. People clapped. Not just Ruth. Not just my allies, neighbors, residents. Even the man who had first pointed at me gave a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. After the meeting, several approached me quietly. Some with ideas, some with regret. One woman simply said thank you, then left without another word. Later that night, I stood on my porch and looked out over the quiet hill and the lake beyond. The barricades still glowed under the street lamps. The reflection of the warning signs shimmered like ghosts in the water. But the air was beginning to feel different, like something that had been clenched was finally beginning to release. Not justice yet, but the beginning of it. The formal hearing took place 2 weeks later inside the Shag County Courthouse, in a sterile room that smelled like dry paper and polished wood. The State Environmental Enforcement Division and representatives from the EPA took their seats first, followed by 3 members of the HOA board, now pared down and visibly anxious. At the end of the table, seated stiffly in a navy skirt suit, sat Karen Albright. She looked smaller than I remembered her less iron-willed president, more like someone gripping the last threads of control. Her hair was pulled tight, her folder overstuffed with notes, though I suspected she already knew there'd be no argument strong enough to unspool what was coming. I was called as a witness. Under oath, I walked them through everything. The first time I heard the machines, the photos, the slope violation, the map overlays from my archived work. I cited every document, every permit they didn't file, every email Ruth had uncovered. I showed the before and after images, the sediment plumes, the changes to dissolved oxygen levels, the slope's destabilization, and the threats, those ridiculous, almost cartoonish violations they'd sent to try to shut me up. I kept my voice calm, professional. I didn't need emotion, I had facts. But when I got to the part about the basin, the one they'd filled in, I paused. That floodplain, I said, voice softening, wasn't just a low spot. It was a breathing lung for the lake. It took pressure-stored excess filtered runoff. You don't erase something like that without consequences. The EPA official nodded slowly. The clerk scribbled furiously. Then it was Karen's turn. She stood shakily, cleared her throat, and for the first time she didn't sound commanding, she sounded cornered. I acted in good faith, she began. The community wanted improvements. We believed we were within our rights to manage the land adjacent to the lake for recreational benefit. No permits were filed, the state attorney said. You claimed the soil was from community land. It was not. You misrepresented the project's scope, its jurisdiction, and then retaliated against a private citizen who objected. Karen tried to speak again but faltered. Her lips trembled. Then, without looking at anyone, she said something I never thought I'd hear. I should have listened. I didn't understand how delicate the system was. I thought it was just dirt. I didn't think anyone would get hurt. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked just enough to draw a reaction. The hearing concluded with the expected result. The HOA was found in violation of multiple state and federal environmental statutes. They were ordered to cease all development within 300 feet of Echo Lake for a minimum of 5 years, pay restitution, and cover the full cost of environmental remediation, including hiring a federally certified contractor, issue a formal public apology to residents and to me, the reporting party, undergo external oversight for any future construction or landscaping activity. Karen Albright was stripped of her role as president and banned from serving on the board of any homeowners association in the state for 10 years. A civil suit for trespassing and property damage was pending. My attorney assured me the case was solid. We wouldn't pursue criminal charges, but she would pay damages. And the best part, the state appointed a Community Ecological Advisory Board to oversee the restoration effort. They asked me to chair it. I accepted. Back in Silver Glen, things changed fast. Construction crews arrived not to build, but to undo. The artificial fill was hauled away. The scarred basin was carefully excavated to return it to its natural contours. Native wetland plants, bulrush, sedge, switchgrass, were planted under supervision. New sediment barriers lined the slope. I worked with students from the local college to monitor turbidity, fish counts, and water clarity. The lake began to breathe again. The first time I saw a dragonfly land on the edge of the restored marsh, I felt a lump in my throat. It was small, ordinary, but also a kind of forgiveness. Meanwhile, the HOA restructured. The board shrank. Meetings became open to public attendance. Transparency became less of a buzzword and more of a requirement. And for once, people paid attention to what was growing, not just what looked good in a brochure. As for Karen, she moved out quietly. No goodbye letter. No confrontation. Just a moving truck one Saturday morning and a few curious glances through window blinds. I didn't go out to see her off. There was nothing left to say. Ruth and I, though we spoke often. She joined the advisory board too. We met every Wednesday to walk the shoreline, take notes, plant wildflowers. One afternoon she said, "Do you think it'll ever go back to the way it was?" I looked across the water. "No," I said, "but maybe that's not a bad thing." Because the lake wasn't the only thing that had been damaged. The people were too. And healing, I come to realize, doesn't always mean restoring what was. Sometimes it means building something better out of what remains. By late summer, a small sign was installed at the trailhead, Echo Lake Restoration Area, protected under state and federal law, coordinated by Silver Glen community and local residents. Below it in smaller letters, in honor of those who stood up when it mattered. I visited it often, not out of pride, out of gratitude, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a bang or a courtroom speech. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in clean water, in new roots, in the quiet ripple of wings over a still living lake. That fall, the wind changed, not just in the way it always does when the air turns crisp and the trees set themselves on fire in reds and golds, but in something deeper, quieter. A shift in the way the neighborhood breathed. It was no longer held hostage by whispers and enforcement letters or false smiles veiling threats of fines. People walked slower. They nodded when they passed. Some even stopped. One morning, I found a bundle of native seeds left on my porch. No note. Just a twine-wrapped packet with a small tag that read, "For the hill." That hill. It still bore the marks of the trauma, the deep gouges, the fractured ledge, the root systems trying their best to hold on. But it was healing, so was I. So, each morning, I worked on it. I laid new netting over the steepest section and used stakes to anchor it deep into the soil. I spread the seeds by hand: switchgrass, goldenrod butterfly, milkweed. I planted willow cuttings where the runoff had carved into the edge, their roots already eager to drink in the cold, damp earth. I watched as birds returned, tentative, at first then bold. I saw deer again. I heard frogs at night. But more than that, I noticed how I had changed. Where once I had kept to myself, content in isolation, now I opened the gate when neighbors walked past. Ruth stopped by nearly every day. We didn't always talk about the lake or the HOA or the board hearings. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all. Just the clouds, the sound of geese overhead, the peculiar magic of silence between people who've survived something together. The Par Echo Lake Restoration Project moved into its second phase. Community stewardship. Residents were now invited to volunteer planting, monitoring, maintaining. We held weekend workshops about invasive species, how to identify water quality issues, how to protect native habitats. I led many of them, standing by the lakeshore, the water now clearer than it had been in months. I watched teenagers drag wheelbarrows of mulch down trails they once used for selfies. I watched parents explain cattails to their children. I saw people fall in love again with the place they had once taken for granted, and slowly the guilt began to dissolve. Because yes, there were still people who blamed me, quietly. A look here, a comment there. But they no longer had a platform. The evidence was too clear, the recovery too real. The lake was no longer a point of contention, it was a symbol of what happens when someone stands up and stays standing. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Autumn State's Department of Environmental Resources. A formal invitation to speak at their annual conference to present a case study titled Grassroots Defense Community Ecology versus Administrative Overreach. I accepted, not out of ego, but because stories matter, evidence matters. And maybe just maybe some other homeowner would hear my words and realize that HOA letters aren't laws, that permits aren't optional. That one voice, if backed by truth, can resonate louder than a boardroom full of compliance bullies. When I spoke, I wore my oldest field jacket, the one I'd used back when I still carried course samplers and topographical scopes. I talked about the slope, about the soil, but I also talked about something harder to measure. I talked about grief, the grief of watching something you love be mistreated, the grief of being dismissed, the grief of standing alone and wondering if you've made a mistake until the moment you know you haven't. And I talked about healing, about how it doesn't come quickly, how it doesn't look like applause or settlements, or even closure. It looks like roots. It looks like quiet mornings, brushing your hands through new grass. It looks like a child skipping stones into clean water and not knowing that 3 months ago, that same shoreline was dying. After the conference, I received letters, not from politicians or lawyers, but from people. A widow in Arizona who had fought her HOA for planting a butterfly garden. A young couple in Oregon whose native lawn had been threatened with fines. A retired man in Georgia who sent me photos of a restored pond behind his property and wrote simply, "You gave me courage." I pinned those letters to a corkboard in my study, not as trophies, as reminders. One crisp October morning, as I stood at the edge of the hill, I saw a girl no older than 8 crouching near the bottom of the slope. She wasn't trespassing, just exploring. She was studying a patch of milkweed, her fingers gently brushing a monarch caterpillar climbing the stalk. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Careful," I said softly. "They're delicate." She looked up at me and smiled. "I know. My teacher says they only eat this plant." "She's right," I nodded. The girl stood brushing dirt from her knees. "Is this your hill?" "Yes," I said. "But you can visit anytime." She beamed, then ran off down the trail where her parents waited. I watched her go, the wind picking up through the golden grass, bending, but not breaking it. That's what healing looks like. That's what it feels like. The lake remained closed to large gatherings for another 4 months. But the water cleared. The oxygen levels stabilized. The frogs returned first, then the minnows, then the herons. I didn't need credit. I just needed to know it would survive. That winter, the snow fell soft and clean, covering the land like forgiveness. I walked the trail, daily boots crunching over ice heart-warm beneath my jacket. And every so often, I'd pause by the sign at the trailhead, run my fingers over the inscription at the bottom. In honor of those who stood up when it mattered. I didn't know who wrote that line, but I knew it was true. And I knew I would keep standing. As long as the wind blew over the hill and the lake still whispered at dawn, I would stand. For the land, for the truth, and for the quiet, unwavering power of doing what's right no matter who tries to bury you.